constitutional fathers knew, and they were living at the end of the 1260 years, that when church and state are joined together, the automatic result is persecution. For example, they knew the history of John Huss, that man who was convicted and burned at the stake for his religious convictions. They knew, for example, that he had been kept in subhuman conditions in prison squalor. They knew that false witnesses were called to testify against him. They knew that he had violated no civil laws. They knew that he was tried for the religious convictions of his conscience. They knew that he was called before a religious tribunal, much like the Sanhedrin at first. He knew that that religious tribunal had pronounced a death sentence against him. And they knew that then they took him to the emperor, to have the emperor stamp his imprimatur upon the sentence of death. And they knew that because of his religious convictions, he was burned at the stake. They knew the history of the church in the Middle Ages when church and state are united or joined together. I'd like to read you a few statements from this very interesting book that I have. It's called Huss the Heretic. It's written by an individual called Poggius the Papist. In fact, this is the man who was sent to arrest John Huss. And actually, as he watched the way that John Huss was treated by the Roman Catholic Church, he actually came to sympathize with John Huss as against the church that he represented. Let me read about the conditions that John Huss was in because of the convictions of his conscience during the Middle Ages. This is on page 19 of this book. After a short while, Huss was let out of his dungeon into a decent chamber, but his feet almost refused to carry him. He swayed as he walked. Listless and unused to the day was the light of his eyes, deathly pale his cheeks, and loose what was left of his teeth, since 11 had fallen out due to the damp prison. The nails on his fingers were terribly long because he had been unable to bite them off for many weeks. Upon his skin was a crust of dirt which exuded an awful stench, and his otherwise brown hair fell in white ringlets upon his rotting and torn garb. This is an individual who belongs to the Roman Catholic papacy describing this. His shoes had rotted upon his feet, and his shirt and loincloth had vanished. The rounded flesh which had covered his bones had shrunken and shriveled, and he had become a picture of woe without equal, unrecognizable to those who had known him before. Horror filled those who looked upon him, and pitying people prepared a bath for him, brought shirts and clothing, and refreshed him with strengthening foods, for which he could only thank with tearful eyes. On page 28, we find this statement: with the clock striking 8 and the bells telling, the procession of bishops, cardinals, and fathers. See, they're taking him to his trial now, to his religious trial. Notice who he's appearing before. The procession of bishops, cardinals, and fathers, and deputies moved toward the church, where a chair had been placed for Huss, about which the seats of the gentlemen were arranged. He was brought there for the convictions of his conscience. He had violated absolutely no civil laws. In fact, when they gave him an opportunity to speak, he said this: God gave to Peter, his disciple, and notice the terminology, very important. God gave to Peter, his disciple, the key to open all hearts and the heaven of faith with it, but not the sword. God gave Peter the what? He gave him the key to open hearts, but not the sword, to slay, as you slay, all those who do not accept your worldly doctrines and who evade them. Did he understand what the sword is? He most certainly understood what the sword was. He said, you haven't been given the sword. You've been given the key to open the heavenly kingdom. When the final vote was taken among the religious dignitaries, 31 votes were cast not guilty. 11 votes were cast for excommunication, and 45 votes were cast for death. And then he was taken to the emperor, who had promised to give him safe conduct back to his home, and he broke his word. And in fact, there was a count there, Count Slum, who told the emperor, and I'd like to read the words that he spoke to the emperor as he was about to sign the death warrant for Huss. This is what he said: Caesar, notice he calls him Caesar. Caesar, desist from such doings. Caesar, Caesar, do not write your name with blood. But Poggius continues saying, but the emperor's ears were deaf and were further closed by the cardinals, bishops, and priests who crowded about him, kissed the hem of his garments, and praised his name when he seized the quill and wrote his name. And Huss was taken, and he was burnt at the stake. You know, I've been in the palace of the Inquisition in Lima, Peru. It's a depressing experience. They actually have models where they show the types of torture that were used against people for no reason other than they did not agree with the church. Torture and death. Some were even burned at the stake, like John Huss was burned at the stake. And it wasn't the church who did it, but the church used the sword of the state in order to accomplish its purpose. The Constitutional Fathers not only knew the history of Europe when church and state are joined together, they also knew the history of the colonial period in the United States. You know, there are many people who misunderstand or don't understand the colonial period. Do you know that during the colonial period, which begins at around 1620, when the Pilgrims arrived in the United States, atheist Jews, Quakers and Baptists were deprived of their religious rights because they did not agree with the established church of the colonies, which was the Puritans, or was the Anglican Church. Did you know that there were Sunday laws in the colonies, and if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you could be whipped, you could be fined, you could be jailed, and in the case of 3 colonies, you could be executed for not coming to church on Sunday? Did you know that they actually cut off the ears of Quakers for coming back when they had been exiled from the colonies? If they came back once, they cut off one ear. If they came back the second time, they cut off the second ear. And if they caught them the third time, they executed them for their religious convictions. Did you know that only people who professed to be loyal to the established church could occupy positions in the civil government? And also, the government paid the salaries of the ministers, interestingly enough. And so the church and the state were joined together, and as a result, you had persecution. You know, many people know the story, for example, of Roger Williams. Roger Williams arrived in the colonies in 1629. He pastored a church there, but he started teaching separation of church and state. He said there are to be 2 kingdoms in this country. Absolutely, but they're supposed to be separate one from another, because that's what Jesus taught. Are you seeing what the 2 horns are? Jesus said 2 kingdoms in the same nation, separate one from another. And of course, what he was teaching went over like a lead balloon. And so they banished him from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he himself says that towards the end of 1635 and the beginning of 1636, he had to flee for 3 weeks through huge snowdrifts to get out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, because he had been banished, and if they found him in there, they could throw him in prison or they could even execute him. And so he ended up in Rhode Island, and he established the capital of Rhode Island, which is Providence. That's interesting that he would call that city Providence.